Grainer Valley, Oklahoma, harvest season, a storm 3 days out. From the air, every wheat field in the county is moving. Combines cutting wide arcs through 40,000 acres of gold grain trucks, trailing dust plumes down every gravel road, the whole valley running like a single machine with one clock. The western sky is the color of a held breath. One field is standing still. 40 acres, full grain, not a single row cut. Move closer. A farmhouse at the field's edge. A porch. A window. Inside an old journal open on a kitchen table. Handwriting cramped, dated 1983, beside a cup of coffee gone cold. Closer still. The field's edge. A young woman, 20 years old. Arms crossed, boots in the dirt, eyes on the wheat. Not panicked, not frozen, watching. Behind her, the phone is ringing again. The elevator, the county agent, the neighbor who has farmed this valley longer than she has been alive. She doesn't move. The storm is coming. Everyone has told her what that means. She has read something they haven't. The morning the whole county started talking about her, Callie Dean was standing at the edge of her family's wheat field, with her arms crossed, watching every other farmer in the valley race against the sky. Combines roared across the Vane Place to the north. Flatbed trucks rattled down gravel roads stacked with grain bins. Men shouted across fence lines to their sons, their brothers, their hired hands. Dust hung in the air, the color of old brass, thick enough to taste on the back of the throat, and it didn't settle because nothing in that valley was standing still long enough to let it. Callie wasn't moving. Her field, 40 acres of winter wheat that should have been cut 3 days ago by anyone's calendar, stood untouched behind her, swaying gold and heavy in the late morning wind, while the storm system crawled toward them from the west like something that had made up its mind. The heads were full, the stalks were straight. The field looked exactly like a field that a sensible farmer would be cutting right now, which was precisely why every person who drove past on County Road 7 that morning slowed down to look. By 8 o'clock, someone at Dellard's Feed and Supply had mentioned it over the counter, and the word spread, the way words spread in small places, faster than the facts, slower than the assumptions that filled the gaps between them. By noon, half of Grainer County had an opinion. By the time the afternoon heat peaked and the western horizon began to take on that particular flat gray that old farmers recognized before they could say why the other half had caught up. She's not harvesting. What does she think she knows? Is she about to lose everything? Earl spent his whole life building. The questions followed her everywhere she went that week, though nobody asked them directly to her face. That wasn't how Grainer County worked. That wasn't how any of this worked. To understand what Callie Dean was doing at the edge of that field, you have to understand what she had already survived in the 4 months before that morning. You have to understand the spring that had tried to break her, the summer that had asked her to hold on anyway, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a person when they have been carrying something heavy alone for long enough that they stop waiting for someone to notice. It started on a Tuesday in late April, which was the kind of ordinary Tuesday that becomes a before and after point in a family's life, without any warning at all. Earl Dean had gone out to the machine shed after breakfast to check the planter settings before the day's seeding run. He was 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades behind equipment rather than behind a desk, with hands that knew the difference between good soil and tired soil by feel alone. He had farmed this ground since he was 19. He had watched his own father farm it before that. He was alone in the shed when it happened. The stroke came without theater. No dramatic collapse, no warning clutch at the chest. He simply found himself on the concrete floor, beside the planter tongue, looking up at the rafters, unable to make his left side answer him. The shed cat found him 20 minutes later. Callie found him 11 minutes after that because she had come looking when the tractor didn't move. He lived. That part needs to be said plainly because in those first hours at the county hospital in Muskrat Falls, it was not a certainty anyone was willing to commit to. He lived, but the man who came home from the hospital 3 weeks later moved slower than the man who had gone in. He tired faster. He needed more time with simple tasks. The doctor used phrases like moderate recovery and ongoing rehabilitation in a tone that suggested patience was now the primary tool available to them. Callie's older brother, Denton, drove down from Tulsa for 4 days. He sat with Earl, helped with the immediate paperwork, spoke to the doctor in the careful voice of a man mentally calculating the distance between this place and his real life. On the 4th morning, he pulled Callie aside at the kitchen table and told her he couldn't stay. He had a job. He had a lease. He had built something up there that he couldn't just walk away from. He said all of this, looking at the table rather than at her, which told her everything she needed to know about how much he believed his own reasons. She told him she understood. She meant it. Understanding something and being glad about it are not the same thing, and Callie Dean was old enough to know the difference. So it fell to her. 300 acres of wheat and hay ground, one aging equipment fleet, two hired men who worked seasonal hours, a father in a recliner, who was trying his best to recover in a planting calendar that did not care about any of the above. She was 20 years old. She had grown up on this land, had driven equipment since she was 13, had spent every summer of her memory learning the particular personality of this soil from a father who believed that a farm had to be understood, not just managed. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for casseroles or phone calls or the particular brand of sympathetic attention that small communities offer when something goes wrong. She got up before the light changed, checked the stock walk, the fields, did the math on seed costs and diesel prices, and a spring that was running 2 weeks dry when it should have been wet. She made decisions. She made them alone. She made some of them wrong and corrected course without announcement, the way farmers do when there's nobody to ask and the ground doesn't wait. The neighbors respected it in the beginning. A hard-working girl doing her best in a hard situation, that was a story people in Grainer County knew how to hold. It fit the shape of things they already believed about what this valley asked of people and what people owed back to it in return. The story they didn't know how to hold was the one where she stopped listening to them. It began 3 weeks before harvest, in the long evenings of late July, when the light stayed golden past 8 o'clock and the wheat had reached the point in its season where a farmer with sense would be checking moisture every other day and watching the sky. Callie was doing both of those things. She was also doing something else. She began walking the field every evening. Not a quick pass along the edges, the kind of walk a person takes to confirm what they already expect to see. She walked slowly, row by row, spending time in parts of the field that didn't look obviously different from any other part. She was watching the way specific patches of the crop moved in the evening wind, not whether they moved, but how the particular character of the movement, which stalks led and which followed, and whether the whole 40 acres was behaving like one thing or like several smaller things pressed together into the shape of one. She watched the swallows. This detail would later seem small to the people she tried to explain it to, but it did not seem small to her. The barn swallows that nested in the equipment shed, eaves had been skimming low over the field all summer in their typical feeding pattern, long looping passes that covered the crop in a kind of loose grid. 3 weeks before harvest, they changed. They began flying tight circles near the tree line at the north end of the field, staying close to the cottonwoods along the creek rather than ranging out over the open grain. She noted it. She didn't yet know what it meant, but she noted it. She paid attention to the soil at the north end of the field, the low ground where the creek bent closest. That corner had always held moisture differently than the rest. Her father had mentioned it once years ago. In the offhand way he sometimes said important things. But this summer the difference was more pronounced. The soil there was holding water in a pattern she hadn't seen before, and when she pressed her palm flat against the earth in the evenings, the temperature differential between that corner and the center of the field was noticeable enough that she started writing it down. This was how she found the journals. She had gone to the attic looking for her grandfather's old moisture charts. Howard Dean had kept detailed records of every season he farmed this ground, and she remembered her father mentioning once that some of them were stored in the attic in tin boxes. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was looking for context, for the specific kind of historical knowledge that couldn't be found in any extension office publication because it lived in the particular memory of a particular piece of ground. She found 3 tin boxes. 2 held the moisture charts she'd expected, organized by year, in a handwriting that was careful and slanted, the handwriting of a man who had taken school seriously before the farm took everything else. The 3rd box held something different, a series of composition notebooks, the kind with the black and white marbled covers labeled on the spines with years rather than topics. Howard Dean had kept field journals for 41 years. Callie sat on the attic floor in the heat of a July evening with a flashlight and read for 3 hours without stopping. The journals were not dramatic documents. They were working records, planting dates, weather observations, equipment, notes, yield figures by field section. Howard wrote about soil the way a doctor writes about a patient, precisely without sentiment, with the accumulated authority of someone who has watched the same subject through many seasons and learned to trust pattern over prediction. She almost missed it. It was buried in the journal from 1983 in an entry dated late September written in a hand that was slightly less careful than usual, as though Howard had written it quickly while the details were still sharp. The entry described a storm system that had moved through the valley, that fall, a slow-moving, low-pressure system that had built over the southern plains and dragged moisture up from the Gulf. The regional forecast had called for heavy rain and damaging winds. Every farmer in the valley with standing wheat had rushed to cut early. Howard's planter had thrown a chain 2 days before the storm, and he had not been able to get the part in time, so his wheat stood uncut while his neighbors stripped their fields bare. What happened next was recorded in Howard's careful, urgent script over 4 subsequent journal entries. The storm arrived with high wind, but steady, moderate rain, not the violent downpour everyone had feared. The wheat that stood absorbed the rain without breaking because the wind, though strong, came from a direction that bent the stalks without snapping them. The drainage along the creek had held. The low north corner of the field, which Howard had spent the previous 3 summers slowly improving with hand-dug channels, moved the water away before it pooled across the grain. The farmers who had cut early got their wheat in dry, but they had cut it 5 days before the grain was finished filling, and those 5 days mattered. The kernels were lighter, the test weight was lower. When prices moved that fall because a late blight hit stored grain across 3 counties, grain that had gone into bins during the unsettled humid weather immediately before the storm, Howard's wheat harvested clean and dry after the storm passed graded at the top of the scale. He sold it into a shortage. It was, Howard wrote in the final entry on the subject, the best price he had received in 11 years of farming that ground. He had also noted with the precision of a man who paid attention to everything, the specific character of the weather pattern that had preceded the storm, the direction from which the low pressure approached, the rate at which the barometric pressure dropped slowly over several days, rather than collapsing all at once in the sharp way that preceded violent systems, the behavior of certain birds near the tree line, the way the soil in the low north corner of the field held water in the days before the rain, as though the ground itself was anticipating a particular kind of moisture rather than bracing against it. Callie read that entry 3 times. Then she sat very still in the attic heat for a long time. The barometric pressure that week had been dropping slowly for 4 days. The low-pressure system, building over the southern plains, was approaching from the southwest, not the south. The swallows had moved to the tree line. The soil at the north end of the field was behaving in exactly the pattern Howard had described. She did not go downstairs and tell her father what she'd found. She did not call the extension office or the elevator or any of the neighbors who had been offering advice since before the wheat had even headed out. She went back down to the field instead in the dark with her flashlight, and she walked the north corner for an hour with the journal open in her other hand, checking what Howard had written against what she could feel under her boots. Then she went to the machine shed and got a shovel. The drainage channel along the creek edge had silted up over 3 seasons of neglect. Not Howard's neglect, and not Earl's either exactly, but the slow accumulation of plant matter and sediment that fills any unattended waterway in flat country. Clearing it properly would take time she didn't have during daylight hours when everything else needed doing. So she started doing it at night. 3 evenings in a row, she worked the channel from the creek bend to the field edge, pulling sediment, cutting overgrowth, reopening the path that Howard had originally dug by hand decades before. Her arms ached. Her boots were ruined by the second night. She didn't mention it to Earl because Earl was managing his recovery with the focused energy of a man who didn't have attention left over for worrying about the things he couldn't control, and she didn't want to give him something new to carry. She told herself she wasn't certain. She told herself she was doing this as a precaution, as one measure among several, as the kind of reasonable preparation that any farmer would take when a storm was coming toward low ground near a creek. She told herself this while knowing in the specific way that 20-year-olds who have been paying close attention to something for weeks sometimes know things that she was not taking a precaution. She was making a bet. The regional forecast came down on a Wednesday, 5 days before the storm was projected to arrive. Heavy rain, damaging winds, possible flash flooding along low-lying creeks and drainage channels. The Weather Service used that exact language, and every farmer who heard it on the radio or read it on their phone thought of the same thing standing grain low ground, creek banks. The extension office issued an advisory. The elevator in Muskrat Falls sent a text message to every registered account. Harvest what you can protect, what you've already cut. Expect delays in receiving for at least 72 hours post-storm. The valley moved. Combines that had been running days started running nights. Grain trucks that had been making 2 trips to the elevator made 4. Neighbors who competed fiercely over yield numbers during every other week of the year started coordinating sharing equipment, taking turns in each other's fields, because the storm was coming for all of them equally, and everybody knew it. The particular solidarity of shared threat settled over the valley like a second kind of weather. Callie Dean's field did not move. Russell Vane noticed first, which was predictable, because Russell Vane was the kind of man who noticed everything that happened within 3 miles of his property line. He was 67 years old, had farmed the Vane ground for 40 years, following his father before him, and held an authority in Grainer County that had nothing to do with any official position and everything to do with the fact that he had been right about enough things for long enough that people had stopped questioning whether he was right about the current thing. He was a big man, still broad through the shoulders despite the age, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that patience reads as power in most situations. He drove a truck that was never dirty. He wore the same brand of work clothes he had worn for 30 years, kept in the kind of condition that communicated care without effort. When Russell Vane pulled his truck onto your lane and got out, the conversation that followed mattered. He pulled onto the Dean Lane on a Thursday afternoon 4 days before the storm was due. Callie was at the field edge when he arrived, notebook in hand, doing her evening observation. She heard the truck on the gravel and didn't look up immediately, which Russell noticed. He walked toward her slowly, the way you approach someone who is concentrating on something you don't entirely understand. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the wheat. Then, "You're going to lose that whole field." His voice carried no particular heat. It was a statement of observed fact, the kind a man delivers when he believes he's doing you a service by not softening it. Callie looked at her field, not at him. "I know what it looks like. Your father wouldn't wait this long." 3 words in that sentence did more work than the other 6 your father wait long. The implication was not subtle. "I'm not ignoring the storm, Mr. Vane." She kept her voice even. "I'm watching something else." He waited for her to continue. She didn't. In the silence that followed, she felt him recalibrate, not toward openness, but toward a different kind of assessment. Russell Vane had not driven over here to be curious. He had driven over here to say something specific, and the conversation so far had not yet reached it. "There's another reason I came by." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper which he held without opening. "I've been watching this storm for a week, watching your situation too, out of respect for what Earl built here. I'd like to make you an offer on the North 40 before this gets worse." Callie turned and looked at him for the first time. The number he named was not insulting enough to be offensive. It was the kind of number that was calculated to sound reasonable to someone who was frightened below market, but not so far below that the gap couldn't be explained by risk and timing and the particular logic of someone doing a favor. It was a number that assumed she was afraid. "No, thank you, Mr. Vane." Something moved behind his eyes that didn't reach his face. "You sure about that? Once the storm hits, that offer doesn't stand." "I understand." He refolded the paper. He put it back in his pocket. He looked at the field one more time, the particular look of a man cataloging what he sees for later reference, then turned and walked back to his truck without another word. Callie watched him go. She wrote 3 lines in her notebook, then she went back to watching the wheat. What Russell Vane said at the feed store the next morning, she would only learn later, pieced together from the careful secondhand accounts of people who had been there. He hadn't said anything specific. He hadn't needed to. He had simply described what he'd seen the Dean girls standing at an uncut field 4 days before a major storm and let the room do the rest of the work. In a place where Russell Vane's judgment was treated as a kind of local weather system in itself, that was enough. The talk that followed took a shape Callie recognized without being surprised by it. Concern first, the kind expressed in casseroles left on the porch, and careful inquiries from women her mother's age who had known Earl since before she was born. She thanked them and kept working. The concern hardened by degrees into something that felt less like worry and more like verdict. At the hardware store, men who had worked alongside Earl for 3 decades said the kind of things people say when they believe they're being honest rather than cruel, that farming wasn't a place for stubbornness. When a storm was coming, that a young person alone out there was bound to make an emotional decision instead of a practical one, that somebody ought to get through to her before she threw away 4 generations of what the Dean family had built. None of them said any of this to her directly. She heard it anyway. Small places have permeable walls. Birch Landry called on Friday morning. He managed the grain elevator in Muskrat Falls, a compact man of 50 with the permanent expression of someone calculating storage capacity. He was not unkind. He had known Earl long enough to feel the weight of what he was saying. But he said it if her wheat took storm damage and graded below standard, the elevator's current pricing contracts wouldn't apply. She would be selling into a spot market at whatever the post-storm number turned out to be. He suggested with the measured urgency of a man who had made this call before that she consider her options while options still existed. She thanked him. She went back to the field. Garrett Wills arrived on Saturday unannounced, which was his professional style. A county extension agent for 11 years, methodical. Careful, the kind of man who wrote everything down and believed in the power of documented recommendation. He was 45, tall and deliberate, with a clipboard that was never far from his hand. He walked the field with Callie for 40 minutes, which was to his credit. He looked at the grain heads. He checked her moisture readings with his own tester. He pointed out the obvious things: the grain was at harvestable moisture. The storm forecast was intensifying. The neighboring fields were already stripped, in the tone of a man who was trying very hard to be helpful rather than directive. At the end of the walk, standing at the field edge in the afternoon heat, he looked at her with something that was almost admiration mixed with genuine bafflement. "I can see you've been out here every day. I can see you've been paying attention. I just can't understand why that attention is pointing you toward waiting." Callie thought about the tin box in the attic. She thought about Howard's handwriting, cramped and faded, describing a storm that nobody else in this valley remembered because nobody else had been writing things down long enough. She thought about the drainage channel she had cleared in the dark with ruined boots, the work that nobody could see because it was underground. "I know what the forecast says, Garrett. I know what the moisture numbers say. I've made my decision." Her voice was steady, and steadiness in that moment cost her something, though she didn't show the cost. He left shaking his head in the particular way of a man who has said everything reasonable and watched it fail to land. That evening, Earl called her inside from the porch. He was sitting in the chair by the window that had become his primary position since coming home from the hospital, positioned so he could see the equipment yard on one side and the edge of the wheat field on the other. He looked better than he had in May, which was not the same as looking well. The stroke had taken something from his face that hadn't come back yet, a particular readiness of expression that Callie associated with her father at full capacity. He had the journal open on his knee. She hadn't told him she'd found it, but he knew the tin boxes were up there. He would have recognized Howard's handwriting. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way he sometimes did when he was working out how to say something that had two edges. Then, "You read the 1983 entry?" Not a question. "Yes, sir." He looked out the window at the field just visible in the failing light. "Your grandfather stood in almost exactly the same spot you're standing in. Half this valley thought he'd lost his mind." Callie waited. He was right. Earl turned the journal over in his hands. But it cost him 2 months of people not looking him in the eye. Even after. Some of them never quite came back to him the same way. She understood what he was telling her. He wasn't telling her she was wrong. He was telling her what being right was going to cost so she could decide if she'd already counted that into the price. "I know," she said. He nodded once slowly. He handed her the journal. "Then go check your mowing adjustments. If you're cutting after the storm, I want those blades set right." She took the journal. She went to the equipment shed. She stood in the dark for a moment before she turned on the lights, letting the weight of the evening settle before she picked up the wrench. The wheat outside swayed in the night wind, gold turning silver in the dark 40 acres of a decision nobody else in that valley believed in yet. The storm was 3 days out. The pressure was still dropping slowly. Everything was exactly as Howard had described. She tightened the first blade bolt and kept working. The Weather Service upgraded its warning on Sunday morning, and the language it used was not the language of suggestion. Flash flood watch. Damaging winds. Potential for 2 to 4 inches of rain over a 6-hour window, with higher amounts possible along creek drainages and low-lying agricultural ground. The kind of language that made farmers who had already cut their wheat feel smart, made farmers who hadn't feel something colder than regret. Callie read the update on her phone at 5:30 in the morning, standing in the equipment shed with a cup of coffee going cold in her other hand. She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket, finished checking the combine's real height, and went out to walk the field before the heat came up. The wheat told her the same thing it had been telling her for a week. The heads were heavy, full, the kernels firm enough that pressing one between thumbnail and forefinger left a clean impression without crushing. The stalks had the particular uprightness of grain that had finished its season's work and was now simply waiting. She crouched low in the north section and pressed her palm flat to the soil. The drainage channel she had cleared ran quiet and open along the fence line, nothing in it yet ready. She stood up. She looked west. The horizon was not yet doing anything visible, but the air had a quality to it that she had learned to associate with Howard's descriptions. A stillness that wasn't actually still, a pressure in the atmosphere that wasn't readable by instrument so much as by the particular way sound carried across open ground. The combine 2 fields over, running late into the weekend, sounded closer than it was. She went back inside to make her father breakfast. Russell Vane made his next move on Sunday afternoon, and he made it without ever picking up a phone or driving anywhere. He had spent 40 years building the kind of social infrastructure that operates on its own once set in motion, and he understood how to use it. He hosted his usual Sunday gathering, 4 or 5 of the older farmers in the valley who rotated through his kitchen the way they had for years, drinking coffee and talking about equipment and prices and the general state of things. Callie would never know exactly what was said in that kitchen, but she understood the results well enough. By Sunday evening, Birch Landry had called her a second time. This call was different from the first. The first had been the call of a man doing his professional duty. This one had the particular texture of a man who had been spoken to by someone he respected. "Callie, I've got to be straight with you. If that wheat doesn't come in before this storm, I can't guarantee you a position at the front of the line on the other side. We're going to be slammed. Damaged grain takes longer to process. You could be looking at a 2-week wait and prices move in 2 weeks." He paused, the pause of a man choosing his next words carefully. "I've known your family a long time. I'm telling you this because of that." She thanked him again. She meant it the same way she had meant it the first time. Not as agreement, but as genuine acknowledgement that he was trying in his way to help. She just didn't need the help he was offering. Garrett Wills called Monday morning with what he described as an update on the forecast models. Though the update was less about meteorology than about the Grainer County Agriculture Committee, which Russell Vane had served on for 11 years. The committee had no legal authority over what a private landowner did with her own crop. Garrett was careful to say this clearly more than once, but the committee could request a welfare check on a farm operation flagged as being in potential distress, and a request had been filed not by Russell personally, but by 3 members of the committee whose names Garrett declined to share, citing concern for the Dean family's situation in the wake of Earl's health event. Callie listened to all of this without interrupting. When Garrett finished, she told him he was welcome to come back out if the committee required a formal visit. Her voice carried no heat. She had learned in the months since April that heat was a currency she couldn't afford to spend on people who were not the real problem. The real problem came to her door on Monday afternoon. She heard the truck before she saw it, that particular engine note, the sound of something well-maintained driven at a deliberate pace. She was in the equipment shed checking the grain tank auger when Russell Vane's truck pulled into the yard. She wiped her hands and walked out to meet him, because meeting something in the open is always better than letting it come to find you in a confined space. He got out of the truck without hurrying. He looked at the barn, the equipment yard, the house, the field beyond. A surveying look, the look of a man taking inventory of things he is considering acquiring. He had done this kind of looking her whole life, but she had never been the subject of it before. "Your father around?" His voice was conversational, the same register he used at the feed store. "He's resting." Russell nodded as though this confirmed something. "I won't keep you long." He looked toward the wheat field. "I want to raise my offer on the North 40. The number I gave you Thursday wasn't fair to what it's worth in a normal year. I know that. I want to give you something closer to that." The new number was higher, still below market, still calculated to appeal to someone under pressure, but higher, the adjustment of a man who had gone home and decided the first offer had been too obvious, that a smarter approach required something that looked more like generosity. "I appreciate the revision," Callie told him. "The answer's the same." Something shifted in Russell's posture, not dramatically, just a degree or two of the easiness going out of it. He had come here expecting the second number to work where the first had not, because in his experience, most people had a threshold, a point at which the pressure from all directions made a reasonable exit look better than continued resistance. He had set the conditions carefully. The community concerned, the elevator, call, the committee inquiry, none of those had been accidents. They were a coordinated environment designed to make standing still feel expensive. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Not angry, something more controlled than anger, which was worse. "I don't think I'm making it hard at all, Mr. Vane. I'm just not selling." He looked at her then with the particular attention of a man recalibrating in real time. He had underestimated something, and he was trying to determine exactly what it was. She held his gaze without filling the silence, which she had learned was its own kind of answer. He got back in his truck. He left. She stood in the yard for a moment after the sound of his engine faded, then went back to the auger. She had 3 hours of daylight left, 2 remaining adjustments to make on the combine before she was ready a drainage channel to check one final time before the storm arrived. The conversation had taken 11 minutes she didn't have, and she didn't spend another second of thinking on it. What she couldn't know yet, was that Russell Vane had not driven back to his farm after leaving the Dean place. He had driven to Earl's hospital contact in Muskrat Falls to ask quite casually what Earl's prognosis looked like long-term. He had driven past the equipment shed again at dusk to count the machines visible through the open doors. He was doing the same thing Callie was doing, building a picture from accumulating details, but the picture he was building was not about a storm. Earl found out about the visit to his hospital contact through the particular grapevine of small-town medical staff who mentioned things to family members without entirely meaning to. He didn't say anything to Callie directly. But that night at dinner, he was quieter than usual, and the quality of his quiet was different, not peaceful, but deliberate. The quiet of a man holding something away from the surface while he figured out what to do with it. She noticed. She didn't ask. Tuesday morning brought the committee visit. Garrett Wills arrived at 8 o'clock with a woman Callie didn't recognize, middle-50s clipboard, the professional neutrality of a person accustomed to being unwelcome. Garrett introduced her as a county agricultural welfare coordinator, which was a title Callie hadn't known existed until that moment. She shook the woman's hand. She walked both of them around the entire operation, the equipment, the storage, the field, the drainage work she'd done along the creek. She answered every question fully. She showed them her moisture readings logged twice daily for 3 weeks. She showed them the combine's service records. At no point during the 90-minute walk did either of them find anything that constituted grounds for intervention. The coordinator wrote several pages of notes. She told Callie that the operation appeared to be in good order and that she would file her report with the committee by end of week. Garrett, walking back to the trucks, looked at Callie with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between professional respect and personal embarrassment about the visit itself. "For what it's worth," he told her quietly at the truck, "the field looks good." She thanked him. She meant that too. What she found that evening, Tuesday, 2 days before the storm, was the detail she had missed in her first 3 readings of Howard's 1983 entry. She had been focused on the meteorological observations on the pattern matching between that season's storm and this one. She had read the outcome, Howard's late harvest, the premium price, the storage mold that hit other farms, as a vindication of watching and waiting. She had not read closely enough what happened to the farms that moved first. The 1983 entry had a section she had skimmed 3 paragraphs about the farms on the north end of the valley, the biggest operations, the ones with the most to lose. Howard had noted that they had harvested early as expected. He had noted that their yield numbers were solid, the grain was ready by every standard measurement. What he had also noted in careful detail was that the weather in the 4 days before the storm had been unseasonably humid, the kind of humid that settles moisture back into grain that has already dried in the field. Grain cut in that window went into bins at a moisture content that looked acceptable on a handheld tester, but crept upward in storage as the sealed environment trapped what the open air had pushed back in. The mold hadn't come from the storm, it had come from cutting in the wrong 4 days. Callie sat with the journal at the kitchen table for a long time after reading this. The implications were not small. She had understood her own decision as a specific bounded bet about her own 40 acres based on one man's observations about one storm from 41 years ago. What she was looking at now was larger. She was looking at the likelihood that the farms around her, the farms that had rushed to cut in the humid, unsettled days before the front arrived, had already made the error that would cost them. The storm itself might not even matter. The damage was potentially already done in the form of grain sitting in bins right now, right across the valley at moisture levels that would creep in the wrong direction over the next 2 weeks. She thought about saying this to someone. She thought about calling Garrett Wills or Birch Landry, or even appearing at Russell Vane's door with the journal open to the relevant page. She thought about what any of those conversations would look like, a 20-year-old girl arriving with her dead grandfather's notebook, to tell the valley's senior farmers that they had already made the mistake they were accusing her of courting. She closed the journal. She put it back on the shelf where Earl could reach it. There were things you could not say and be heard, and knowing which things those were, and making your peace with the knowing, was its own form of intelligence. That night, Earl asked to see the journal again. He took it to the porch and read the 1983 entries by the yellow light of the porch lamp, the moth circling above his head, The western sky clear and dark for what both of them understood were the last clear hours before the system arrived. She brought him coffee and sat on the porch steps and didn't try to make conversation. After a long while, Earl set the journal on his knee. He looked west. "Russell came to see me," he said, "while you were at the field Monday." She had suspected. She said nothing, let him continue. "He told me you were putting the family in a position it didn't need to be in. Said he was offering me a chance to do something about it while there was still time." Earl's hands moved on the journal cover, not restless exactly, more like a man who is feeling the weight of something he's holding. He said a man who built something his whole life ought to have some say in what happens to it when he can't run it himself. The precision of that sentence, its understanding of where Earl's vulnerability actually lived, told Callie everything about how seriously Russell had been paying attention. He had not come to bully Earl. He had come to offer Earl a story about himself that was easier than the one he was currently living. The story of a patriarch who stepped in to protect what he'd built rather than a man recovering in a chair, while his daughter made decisions he wasn't sure he understood. Earl looked at her. In the porch light, she could see that he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the stroke. "Con kachak kong," and then catching himself in English. "Are you sure?" The question carried more weight than the words themselves. It was the question of a man who wanted to believe, who was looking for the specific kind of certainty that would let him set down the thing he'd been carrying. This was the loneliest moment of the 4 months. Not the hardest. The night in April, when she'd sat in the hospital waiting room alone, had been harder. But the loneliest because the person she most wanted to believe her was the person whose doubt was most reasonable. "I'm as sure as the ground lets me be," she told him. "The rest is just weather." He was quiet for a long time. Then he handed her the journal, nodded once, and went inside. She sat on the steps with the journal in her lap until the moths settled and the night sounds came up full around her. The pressure in the air was different now, not dramatic but unmistakable. Something was gathering. The storm announced itself on Wednesday evening, not with rain, but with wind. It came from the southwest in the early afternoon, a steady push that bent the tree line along the creek and rattled the loose tin on the barn's east face. Callie spent the afternoon doing the last things that could be done, securing equipment, closing barn doors, checking the drainage channel. One final time it was clear open, running exactly as designed, ready to carry whatever came at it. She checked the combine's battery charge. She checked the header clearance. She did all of this with the focused calm of someone who has prepared for a specific thing and is now simply waiting for it to arrive. The sky went wrong around 5 o'clock. Not dark in the ordinary way of evening, but dark in the flat, deliberate way that moves from the horizon inward, pressing color out of the landscape from the edges toward the center. The wheat still standing turned silver and then gray as the light went. Callie stood at the field edge and watched it for a few minutes, then went inside. Earl was at the kitchen window. He had his coffee. He didn't ask any questions. The power went at 8:17. Callie knew the time because she checked her phone when the lights died, some reflex of documentation she'd developed over the spring. The house went dark and immediately smaller, the rooms collapsing to the radius of the battery lantern she set on the kitchen table between them. Outside, the rain arrived. It came the way Howard had described it, not in a wall, not the violent sheet that people feared, but in a steady, deliberate fall, hard enough to hammer the roof continuously, but even enough to have a rhythm. The wind moved in gusts rather than sustained fury, which meant the wheat was bending and releasing, rather than being held down at an angle until it broke. She knew this without being able to see it. She knew it the way you know the behavior of something you have spent weeks learning. A transformer blew somewhere to the north. The flash was visible through the kitchen window, a brief blue-white pulse above the tree line, and then that quadrant of the valley went fully dark. The radio on the counter, battery-powered, crackled with flood warnings for creek drainages across 3 counties. The creek at the north edge of her field was mentioned by name: Sutter Creek, watch for rapid rise. Do not attempt to cross at low water bridges. She thought about the drainage channel. She had done the work. The work was either enough or it wasn't. The fence wire at the southeast corner of the equipment yard had come loose in the wind. She could hear it, a rhythmic slap against the metal post that went on for what felt like an hour before the gust shifted and it stopped. The smell of rain on dry soil came in under the kitchen door, heavy mineral, the smell of the earth giving up heat all at once. Earl sat across the table from her. He had his hands wrapped around the lantern's base as though drawing warmth from it, though the night wasn't cold. He was looking at the table rather than at the window, listening with the particular attention of a man who has spent a lifetime reading weather through walls. Every few minutes, a gust came that was stronger than the others, and the house responded the creak of roof trusses, the rattle of the north-facing windows in their frames, the low moan of the equipment, shed doors straining against their latches. Neither of them slept. Neither of them talked much. Around midnight, Earl reached across the table and picked up the journal, turned it over in his hands, once set it back down. It was the closest he came to saying what they were both thinking, which was that by morning they would know whether the last 4 months had been a form of wisdom or a very expensive way of proving everyone right. At 2 in the morning, the rain shifted. The rhythm on the roof changed, still falling, but lighter, the particular sound of a system that has passed its peak and is now spending what remains. The wind dropped below the threshold that made the barn doors strain. The radio reported flooding at 2 locations on Sutter Creek, both downstream from the Dean property, which meant the creek was running high but had not overtopped at the Northfield edge. Callie thought about the drainage channel, open, ready, doing its work in the dark. She thought about Howard writing in his journal by lamplight 41 years ago, describing a storm that nobody else in the valley had bothered to record because they were too busy dealing with what it had cost them. She thought about Russell Vane's truck leaving her yard on Monday afternoon, the particular set of his shoulders as he walked back to the door, the look of a man recalibrating. She thought about her father's hands on the journal, the question he had asked on the porch. The answer she had given him, the rest is just weather. At 3:15, the rain stopped. Not gradually, it simply stopped, the roof going quiet in the space between one gust and the next, the silence so complete that the absence of sound was almost physical. The radio said the system had pushed through, clearing expected by morning, temperature to drop 12 degrees by sunrise. Callie looked at the window. Nothing visible yet, full dark, the power still out across half the valley. She looked at her father, who had his eyes closed but was not asleep. She looked at the journal on the table. She pulled on her boots. "Where are you going?" Earl's eyes were open now. "To listen." She picked up the flashlight from the counter. "The rain stopped. The wind's down. I can hear the drainage if I get close enough." He didn't try to stop her. She went out the kitchen door into the dark. The yard was wet gravel and puddles that reflected the flashlight back at her in fragments. The air was cold in the way that comes after a storm has wrung humidity from the atmosphere, sharp and clean in a way that midsummer Oklahoma almost never smells. She crossed the yard to the field edge and stood at the place she had stood every evening for 3 weeks. She turned off the flashlight. In the dark, she could hear the drainage channel running a small sound, steady, the water finding its path and taking it, moving away from the field, doing exactly what she had spent 3 evenings clearing it to do. She stood there for a long time, listening to the water move in the dark, unable to see anything, unwilling, yet to know for certain what the morning would show her. There was something in this moment standing between the work that was done and the evidence that would confirm or destroy it that she wanted to hold for a minute longer. Not because she was afraid of what she'd find, because she understood in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone in that valley that this was the last moment before it became a story instead of a life. The water ran in the dark. The field was quiet above it. She turned the flashlight back on and went inside to wait for morning. The sky lightened before the sun appeared, the dark giving way to a gray that was almost silver, the kind of early morning that arrives after a storm like an apology. Callie had not slept. She had sat at the kitchen table through the last hours of the night with cold coffee and Howard's journal not reading, just keeping the company of it, waiting for the light to reach the point where she could see what she needed to see. She pulled on her boots at 5:10. Earl was in the chair by the window, awake, his hands in his lap, watching the field edge emerge from the dark as the sky continued to lighten. He didn't say anything as she went out. He didn't need to. The question between them had been sitting on the table all night, and the answer was outside. The yard was soft underfoot, the gravel buried under a 1/4 inch of standing water in the low spots near the barn. The temperature had dropped as promised. She could see her breath, which was not something that happened in midsummer Oklahoma without a serious system having moved through. The equipment shed doors had held. The barn was intact. A length of tin had peeled back from the roof corner on the east face, curling upward like a page which would need fixing but was not a disaster. She walked to the field edge. She stopped. The wheat was standing. Not perfectly, some stalks on the west side had a lean to them from the sustained wind direction. In the north corner near the creek showed the pressed, heavy look of grain that had taken real moisture at the base. But standing, not lodged, not snapped at the nodes in the way that happened when a storm caught wheat at the wrong point in its structure. The heads were bent with water weight drooping in the particular way that resolves itself as the plant dries, rather than the way that signals permanent damage. She walked into the rows. This was the part she had not let herself imagine in any detail during the weeks of preparation, and the night of waiting, the specific physical experience of walking into the field after the storm and finding out. She had held the possibility of two outcomes with equal deliberateness because she understood that certainty held before the evidence is available is not confidence but delusion. Now the evidence was available. She moved slowly row by row, lifting heads and examining the grain, pressing kernels, checking the color of the stalks at the waterline. The north corner had taken the most water exactly as expected. The drainage channel had carried the bulk of the creek's rise away from the field, but the lowest two rows in that corner had been in standing water for some portion of the night. She crouched and examined the grain there carefully. Wet at the base, grain heads intact. Some of the lower leaves had that flattened gray look of plant material that had been submerged. It was the worst section of the field. It was also the section she had specifically anticipated, the section she had designed the drainage work to protect by limiting the damage to these rows rather than allowing it to spread across the full corner. She stood up. She looked down the row toward the field's center, where the wheat stood unchanged, heavy-headed full. The revelation did not arrive as a single moment. She had read enough of Howard's journals by now to know that real answers in farming almost never did they accumulated instead, through the accumulation of specific observed details until the weight of evidence became undeniable. What she felt in that moment was not triumph. It was closer to the particular relief of a person who has been holding their breath for 3 weeks and has finally been given permission to exhale. She walked the field for an hour before she went back to the house. Earl was at the kitchen window when she came through the door. He had moved from the chair to stand, which he did carefully these days. The way a man does when standing requires more intention than it used to. He was watching her face rather than asking a question, because after 58 years of farming, he understood that the face of someone coming in from a field after a storm contains all the information you need before a word is spoken. She set Howard's journal on the table. She looked at her father. "It's standing." He closed his eyes. Not long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. The movement was so small it would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know his face well. Then he opened them again, nodded once with the deliberateness of a man accepting something he has been offered carefully, and said, "Coffee's hot." It was the most Earl Dean thing he could have said in that moment, which was exactly why it broke something loose in her chest that she spent the next 30 seconds pretending not to feel. She poured the coffee. She sat down. Outside, the valley was beginning to wake up to what the storm had left. What it had left was considerable. She learned the full scope of it over the following hours, in the way you learn things in a rural county phone calls. Radio reports, the occasional neighbor driving past slowly enough that the observation was almost conversational. A section of County Road 7 had washed out at the Sutter Creek crossing. 3 equipment sheds in the valley had taken roof damage significant enough to require immediate attention. The low fields along the creek's middle section, where the drainage was old and had not been maintained, had flooded across 3 different properties, the water rising high enough in one case to reach the combine parked in the adjacent yard. The grain reports were slower to come because grain damage lived inside bins where you couldn't see it yet. The first indication came from the elevator Birch Landry, who had been at his facility since before dawn, assessing what the humidity had done to incoming grain. Already in temporary storage, sent a text message to his contact list mid-morning that simply read, "Receiving suspended until further notice, pending quality assessment." Callie read it twice, then set her phone face down on the table. She had work to do. The combine started on the first try, which was a small grace she accepted without comment. She had it in the field by 9 o'clock, moving through the rows with the focused precision of a woman operating equipment she had learned on this exact ground. Adjusting for the weight of wet grain, taking the corners wide to avoid the drainage channel embankment, working the north corner last, and most carefully, where the waterline damage required slower ground speed to avoid pushing compromised stalks through the header. Earl sat on the porch and watched. He had a thermos of coffee and Howard's journal on his knee, though she noticed from the field that he wasn't reading it so much as keeping the company of it, the same way she had during the night. His presence on that porch, upright in the chair watching, that was its own form of participation, and she felt it out there in the cab, the way you feel a hand on your shoulder, even when nobody is touching you. She cut the field in 10 hours across 2 days the second day, brighter and drier than the first, the sun doing the work that the storm had interrupted. The wheat came off clean. The grain tank readings on moisture were the best she'd seen in 3 years of operating the combine on this ground. On the second afternoon of cutting, her phone began to ring in a new way. Not the calls of concern or caution or professional duty that had defined the weeks before the storm. These were different calls from people who had heard something, who were starting to understand that the thing they had all agreed was a mistake might require reclassification. Garrett Wills called first. His tone had shifted from the measured diplomacy of his earlier visits to something more direct. "Your moisture numbers, what are you seeing?" she told him. A silence followed that she recognized as the sound of a man updating his model of the situation. He asked if she'd be willing to share her data for the county's post-storm agricultural report. She said she would. The call she hadn't expected came Thursday afternoon while she was at the elevator. Birch Landry met her at the scale house himself rather than leaving it to his staff. He was a compact man who moved efficiently, never wasted motion, but he stood at the side of her truck for a moment before saying anything which was not his usual efficiency. The quality numbers had come back on his first post-storm assessment. The grain that had come in during the 4 days before the storm, the grain cut in the humid window that Howard's Journal had specifically identified, was showing moisture migration in storage. Not catastrophic yet, but moving in the wrong direction fast enough that he'd already been on the phone with 3 different operations about potential grade downgrades. Callie's grain came in at the top of his quality scale. Birch looked at her ticket, then at her. He was not a man who expressed embarrassment easily, and he didn't exactly express it now. But something in his face acknowledged the distance between the calls he had made to her last week and the number currently on her ticket. "I'll move you to the front of the line," he said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who is being straightforward as a substitute for an apology he doesn't quite know how to frame. "I appreciate it," Callie told him. She meant it the same way she had meant every thank you she'd given in the past 2 weeks, genuinely, without performance, without the edge that would have made the moment about something other than what it was. The price that week was up. The reports of storage mold spreading across 3 counties had reached the commodity market before the weekend, and the specific grade Callie's wheat had achieved was the grade that processors were now paying a premium to secure. She did the math in the truck on the way home twice, because the first time she thought she'd made an error. She hadn't. The season that had started with her father on a concrete floor in April was going to survive. More than survive. She pulled into the Dean yard and sat in the truck for a moment with the window down, listening to the ordinary sounds of the place, the equipment shed, fans cycling the barn, cat crossing the gravel with its particular authority, the cottonwoods along the creek moving in a light wind that carried nothing threatening in it now. Everything looked the same as it always had. Everything was different. Earl was on the porch. She got out of the truck, walked to the steps, sat down on the second one with her back to the house. She told him the number. He was quiet for a long time. "Your grandfather would have understood every decision you made." He said it simply without elaboration, which was the only way the sentence could carry the weight it carried. It was not a comparison or a tribute. It was a recognition, the recognition of a man who had watched his daughter make the hardest kind of bet available to a farmer, the bet that requires you to trust your own reading of a thing when every voice around you is pointing the other way. She didn't answer. Some things land better without a response. The talk in the valley changed over the following week gradually, then more quickly, in the way that community narratives shift when the evidence becomes impossible to frame the old way. People who had been certain of her mistake were now certain of her wisdom with the particular confidence of people who had never quite been certain of either. The diner in Muskrat Falls, which had hosted the most sustained conversation about the Dean girl's stubbornness throughout the summer, now hosted a different conversation delivered in the same tones with the same coffee cups by many of the same people. How she had paid attention when others hadn't. How she had known something the rest of them missed. How the old ways of keeping records had something to teach the new ways of reading satellite forecasts. Callie heard about these conversations the same way she had heard the earlier ones at a remove through the permeable walls of a small place. She didn't correct the record or add detail. The story the community was building was close enough to true in the ways that mattered that she saw no reason to complicate it. Let them believe what helped them. Let the lesson land however it needed to land. What she kept private was the specific cost of those weeks, not the financial cost, which had resolved in her favor, but the other kind. The loneliness of being right before the evidence appeared. The particular weight of watching her father absorb doubt he hadn't earned. The 11 minutes with Russell Vane in the yard on Monday, the number he had named the calculation behind it. These were not things she planned to discuss at the diner. Russell Vane's situation became the Valley's second major conversation of that season, moving in a lower register than the first in the careful way that communities discuss the misfortunes of powerful men who are still present. His grain had been among the first assessed at the elevator. The moisture numbers were not catastrophic, but they were bad enough that the lot he'd planned to move in the strong post-storm market had been held back pending regrading, which meant he had missed the premium window by waiting too long after having cut too early. The particular irony of this, that his rush had cost him the timing advantage he'd sacrificed quality to secure, was not lost on the people who understood what had happened, though most of them had the sense not to say it within his hearing. He had also, Callie later learned, contacted the mill he'd planned to supply and discovered that their purchase order had been revised downward while the mold situation across the region sorted itself out. The combination of grade issues, mistiming the lost contract, the money Russell had committed, expecting a shortage he could supply into that picture was not catastrophic for a man of his resources. But it was the kind of season that leaves a mark. She did not feel satisfied by this. She recognized the absence of satisfaction as its own kind of information about who she was or who she was trying to be. What she felt instead was something closer to recognition, the understanding that the same market that had rewarded her patience had punished his impatience, and that neither outcome was personal, even if the human story that surrounded it had felt intensely so. Farming was like that. The ground didn't hold grudges, the weather didn't make exceptions. The price either reflected what you'd done or it didn't, and the ledger kept its own records. It was 3 weeks after the storm on a Thursday evening in late August that she heard the truck on the gravel. She was at the kitchen table working through the fall planning numbers when the engine note reached her that particular sound, well-maintained, deliberate pace. She did not move for a moment. Then she got up, went to the window, confirmed what she already knew, went back to the table, closed her notebook, put the kettle on. She heard his boots on the porch steps. The knock was measured 3 times the knock of a man who is not sure of his welcome but has decided to come anyway. She went to the door. Russell Vane looked older than he had in July. Not dramatically 67 was not an age at which a single difficult season rewrites a man's face entirely. But something had settled differently in him, some arrangement of the features that suggested the summer had required more internal negotiation than he usually submitted to. He held his hat in both hands, which she had never seen him do before. "I was wondering," he said, "if I might come in and see that journal. Your grandfather's, if you don't mind." He said it straightforwardly, without preamble or softening, which she suspected was the truest version of what he was capable of offering. She looked at him for a moment. Behind her, she heard her father shift in the chair by the window. "Come in," she told him. She stepped back from the door. He came in slowly, the way a large man moves in a space he's been invited into rather than one he owns. He glanced toward Earl. Something passed between the two men, brief, the specific currency of people who have known each other for decades and have something recent to acknowledge without being able to say it directly. Earl gave a small nod. Russell looked away first. Callie set 2 cups on the table. She poured the coffee. She went to the shelf where Howard's journal lived, now not back in the tin box in the attic, but on the shelf with the current farm records where it belonged, and brought it to the table. She set it down in front of the empty chair across from her own. Russell sat. He put his hat on the table beside him. He looked at the journal for a moment without touching it, then opened it with a care that surprised her. Not the brisk efficiency of a man consulting a reference, but the deliberateness of someone handling something that has earned its significance. He read for a long time. She let him. Earl was quiet in his corner, not reading, not watching exactly, simply present the way the porch lamp was present, providing something essential without demanding acknowledgement for it. Outside, the August evening moved through its ordinary paces. A truck on County Road 7, the barn cat on the gravel, the cottonwoods in the light wind. Russell turned pages without looking up. She watched his hands, those large, careful hands that had farmed this valley's ground for 4 decades, moving across Howard's entries with an attention she recognized. It was the attention of a farmer reading about farming, which is different from any other kind of reading, because the reader is always simultaneously inside the text and inside their own fields, measuring what they're learning against what they know. He stopped at the 1983 entry. He read it slowly. He turned back and read the entry before it, then forward to the entries after. He spent a long time with those pages. When he finally looked up, he didn't speak immediately. He looked at the journal, then at the shelf where she'd taken it from, then at her. Something had rearranged itself in his expression that she couldn't quite name, Not shame exactly, and not apology, but something in the neighborhood of both that had been filtered through a personality not built for either. He kept good records. His voice was quieter than she was accustomed to hearing from him. He paid attention, Callie said. For 40 years on the same ground. Russell looked at the journal again. He turned to the front page where Howard had written his name and the start date in the same careful slant as everything that followed. He studied it as though the handwriting itself contained information he hadn't expected. Earl spoke from his corner the first time he'd spoken since Russell had come through the door. He always said the ground would tell you what it needed if you were willing to listen long enough. Russell closed the journal. He kept his hand on the cover for a moment, not pressing down, just resting there. He looked at the cover at his own hand on it, at the table. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank. The silence in that kitchen was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of three people who understood each in their own register that the conversation most worth having in that moment was not the one that would be spoken. He stayed for 40 minutes. He asked her 2 questions about the drainage channel, specific technical questions that told her he had been thinking about the north end of his own property since the storm. She answered them fully. He listened the way farmers listen when they are taking something in rather than waiting for their turn to speak. When he stood to go, he picked up his hat from the table. He looked at the shelf where she'd returned the journal. "I'd like to bring my son-in-law out sometime," he said. "If you'd be willing to let him read that section." "I'd be willing," Callie told him. He nodded. He looked at Earl. "Good to see you up, Earl." Earl raised his coffee cup a fraction. It was enough. She walked Russell to the door, but not to his truck. He crossed the yard alone, got in without looking back, drove out the lane at the same deliberate pace he had arrived. She watched until the taillights reached the road, then went back inside. Earl was looking at the shelf. "Your grandfather would have done exactly what you just did," he said. Not exactly more slowly, she thought, with more visible reluctance. But the ending would have been the same. A man like Howard Dean didn't turn people away from knowledge. He only asked that they come through the door correctly. She picked up the journal. She held it for a moment, feeling the cover's worn texture under her fingers, the weight of 40 years of a man paying attention to a specific piece of ground. She put it back on the shelf. The season wasn't over. Fall planting decisions were 6 weeks out, and she had observations to record while the details were still fresh. What the north corner had done under the storm's moisture load, how the drainage had performed, what adjustments would improve the channel's capacity for next time. She got her notebook from the table. She found a pen. She sat down to write. Outside, the evening settled over the valley without drama. The sky moving through its gradations from gold to pink to the flat gray that preceded full dark. The creek running its ordinary level, the fields across the road lying bare now, where combines had moved through them in the weeks before the storm. Her own field was cut, done its season complete. The ground was already doing the quiet work of receiving what the season had left, drawing nutrients back down through the stubble, preparing for what came next. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She wrote the first line drainage channel performed as designed along North Fence Creek rose to within 18 inches of field edge. No incursion across rows beyond the predicted zone. She kept writing. Across the valley, 2 other farmers were having conversations that Thursday evening that she would only hear about later. A man named Tull Braddock, who ran 400 acres on the valley's east end, was telling his wife that he thought they ought to start keeping better seasonal records. Not just yield numbers, but weather observations, the kind of thing that built a picture over time. His wife, who had watched the summer's events with more attention than Tull realized, said she thought that was a good idea. She didn't mention the Dean girl directly because she didn't need to. The reason was self-evident. On the valley's south side, a younger farmer named Pete Calhoun, 26, recently taken over his family's operation from his own ailing father, had called Garrett Wills that afternoon to ask where a person might find historical weather pattern data for Grainer County going back 40 or 50 years. Garrett had given him several sources, then paused before adding that there was also a private record he might ask about if he found the right door to knock on. Pete Calhoun wrote down the name Dean without being told why. Callie didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook, recording the specific facts of a specific storm on a specific piece of ground, adding her own handwriting to a record that had begun before she was born. This was not a dramatic act. It was not a declaration of anything or a message to anyone. It was the work, the particular unglamorous, essential work of paying attention and writing down what you find so that the next person who needs to know won't have to start from nothing. Earl had fallen asleep in the chair by the window, which he sometimes did in the evening since the stroke. A deep, quiet sleep that came quickly now. His body demanding the recovery his pride didn't always allow him to acknowledge during waking hours. She looked at him for a moment. His hands were in his lap. His chest moved in the slow rhythm of real sleep. She turned back to her notebook. The ground outside was dark, the creek running the empty field absorbing the night. Somewhere to the north, Russell Vane's truck was pulling into his own lane. Somewhere in the valley, combines sat in sheds and grain rested in bins, and the season's accounting was being done in the particular language of price and weight and grade, the language that translated 40 years of a man's attention into a number on a check. The number that said whether the attention had been worth what it cost. The Dean Farms number said it had been. Callie wrote the next line, barometric drop rate confirmed against 1983 entry, approximately 0.08 per hour, over 96 hours preceding storm arrival, consistent with pattern described by H. Dean. She wrote the next line after that. Outside, the cottonwoods moved. The barn cat crossed the yard on its own business. The valley settled into the ordinary dark of a late August night that had nothing threatening in it, nothing bearing down, nothing to brace against, just the particular piece of a piece of ground that has been through something and is still standing the way it has stood through every other thing before this, tended by hands that understood it was worth attending. She kept writing until her coffee was cold, until the lamp in the kitchen was the only light visible from the road, until she had recorded everything the season had taught her in language clear enough that someone else could use it 40 years from now. Then she closed the notebook, put it on the shelf beside her grandfather's, turned off the light, and went to bed.